I'm going to talk about bats. I'm going to talk about other wildlife as well that you can encourage either in your garden, on your farm, around your house. So there are measures that can be done. I'm not going to give the answer, Joe, until the very end, so you're going to have to hang on. Bat boxes, I'm going to have to stop the sentence. Bat boxes are really, I'll stop there, and he's going to have to wait till the end for the finish of that sentence. But we're going to look at a few species, mainly bats are the big interest in my life, but there's lots of other wildlife that catch my attention too. And there are measures that you can put in that are fairly straightforward. It goes from very cheap measures to extremely expensive measures you can put in to encourage wildlife on your farm. So we have been trying that for the last 15 years on our farm up in Tirworker, and it has been very successful, and some of it's very, very cheap and some is very dear. And some of the cheapest ones have been the most successful, I have to say. Now, it's a wee bit bright in the room to see this, but this is the kind of thing we expect for bats living in a Dracula's castle in Transylvania.
So now you're home?
We tried building this, but it cost a fortune. We had to stop. Yeah. So actually, I went to Transylvania a few years ago. It was a great place for a bat conference. It's a perfect place for a bat conference. But we didn't see Mr. Dracula at all. So they were actually saying, Dracula never lived in Transylvania, so I don't know what you're coming here for. But bats don't tend to live only just in Dracula's castle, and with these beautiful interiors, these lovely Gothic interiors, they can live in the very most basic of places, or modern places, old places, new places. This is a house that I'll be visiting on Monday that has a great number of bats, and thankfully the lady who has the bats in the house is very interested and very keen on them. But sometimes, like in this situation, she has to re-roof, and she has to find a way that the bats can be accommodated while re-roofing, and she's been very good about that. Now, bats can be difficult to see if they're in the house. Can anybody see where the bat is in this attic? Sorry, it's a wee bit bright here, but actually the bat is here, tucked into the insulation, so it kind of likes this insulation, this itchy, scratchy insulation that we don't like so much. So often bats are found in great big attics like this, but they can be found in their small numbers or in individuals in houses, in sheds, in barns. Bat boxes are something that we saw earlier on. We saw Peter and Margaret Britton with them, and one for John Joe as well. And the bat boxes can be very successful if they're put up in the right place. Now the GLOS scheme has encouraged the use of bat boxes, and Bat Conservation Ireland didn't really have a full input into that, so that some of the things we would have changed if we had been involved in the consultation. Some of you are involved in GLOS, we're in GLOS ourselves, and they were insisting on things like 3 boxes to a tree. We wouldn't necessarily agree that that's necessary for bat boxes. Now the bat boxes come in very expensive forms like this, or they can be very cheap as well. You can make a timber box for very, very little money. Often the crucial thing about a bat box and its success, actually I was looking at a bat box in a shop in Narberry yesterday, and one of them was very well built, and the other one, unfortunately, the big mistake you can make is the gap to let the bats in. And that's the crucial thing. If you get the gap right, your box is going to be more successful. So they only want a gap of about 15 to 20 millimeters. If you have it any bigger, you're going to have a nice blue tit box. And I love blue tits, they're great, but if they take over all your boxes, it's a bit depressing when you're going checking for bats. Now this is a measure we've put into well, we call it a shed. It was originally a shed that started to fall down a few years ago. So the bat mitigation is actually here. And it's a bat box that's built into the wall. And with that box, you can either open the back of it and give them an attic, or you can just keep them within the box itself. So the bats come in and out of this slot here. So it can be plastered over in the same way that the rest of the wall is, so it actually becomes almost invisible. There's a few other measures at the top of this building to allow bats into the very apex. So there can be very cheap ways of getting bats in, like literally raising a tile or raising a bit of lead flashing, or you can go for more expensive stuff. So this is a style of bat box in a stable we had adapted in recent years. It was a cow shed at one stage. Now you can see there's a starling lives in there just above it, and this is the consequences of that. So the bats moved out of that quite a long time ago, because I think they were just sick of the starling jumping up and down top of their heads all the time. So, but it was used a long time ago, but it hasn't been used in years. This is a very successful style of box that I would recommend. and we call it the apex box, or ridge box, because it actually has just an apex like that, just like the top of an attic. And that one is on a tree up our lane, and it has bats almost throughout the year. So that's a very successful design of box, far more successful than the original ones you would have seen, the standard bat box design. And this is a very successful box indeed. It's called we call it a mini wedge. It sounds like a wedgie, but not quite, a mini wedge. And that's again in the same stable. And there are 3 bats in that at the moment in our stable. And they use that box throughout the year. They hibernate in that box. They're there in the summer. They're there in spring and autumn. So that's a very, very successful design for bats. I saw this design in France, and we decided to copy it. It hasn't been entirely successful, but the whole idea was that you had a jam jar at the bottom, so you could see the bat poo from the bottom of without having to look into the box at all. You could see that the bats were using it or not using it. So we have had bats use it over the years, but not very much. So if you were looking down into that jam jar, you can see some things like here's the bat poo itself, the bat droppings. And this moth wing here tells me that this was a brown long-eared bat using this box. So if you find in your sheds that little collections of moth wings, it's often evidence that a brown long-eared bat has been present. So I did actually one night see a brown long-eared bat in that box, but most of the time I don't see bats in that box. This is the standard box, the old style box you might say, and it's painted black there, and that actually increases the success of boxes very, very much. So if you paint it black and point it towards the south, you have a much better chance of a box being used. So that box has been used on occasion, not very much. They prefer the stable just behind the box. But we have had Leisler's bats in that and pipistrelles, so it has been used by 2 species of bat. Again, that's inside that box, so mostly it's a great tit box, and it was a great tit box the other night when I checked it as well. So, but you can see that these are bat poos here, so you can see the difference here. You see these little white specks. If you look in and you see that, it's a bird. And if you don't see the white specks, it looks like this. It could either be a mouse or a bat, but it's unlikely to be a mouse in a bat box, to be honest. So if you see something like this, it's usually a bat. This is another design of box that we've been trying out. I don't know, John, whether you've ever had anything in it yet. Have you a box like this? No. It's not. You don't have that one, no. But we've put up one of these in Moynalty. I don't know whether it's been used yet. It's a design from England. It's more for a woodland bat, but I was just curious to see would it be successful here in Ireland as well. So again, this is what's called a Svegler 2FN box. It sounds like a radio station, but it's one of the more successful and cheaper of the line of boxes. Now they're dear in comparison to timber, but they actually last a very long time. So they can last 20 or 30 years. So they're a good design. They're a German company, so that says a lot about them, and they do have great success. So this is that box more or less opened up, and this is a tree just in the driveway into our house. And this box is slightly different because it's got a little timber panel behind, so it forms a special chamber. Now they found in England that one species of bat called the Nethusius pipistrelle really likes this design. And here in the Republic of Ireland, we've been looking to find this species in its breeding sites. We have lots and lots of evidence of male bats throughout the island, but we can't find females, breeding females. Now, some of the biggest concentrations in Britain and Ireland are found around Lough Neagh. Can't imagine that the bats actually recognise the border itself and won't come south. But that's what's happened so far. We can't seem to find them in the south. Now, we have had Nethusius pipistrelles on our farm, just passing through. So we're hoping that we'll encourage them to stay there. So this is not a Nethusius pipistrelle, it's a soprano pipistrelle. But we have 2 species of bat use the boxes mostly, the common and soprano pipistrelle, and sometimes we get Leisler's bats in the boxes. So at least this has been used very, very quickly after it was put up. So it has been successful in putting up that double front. So that's him up close there. Sorry, it's a wee bit bright for him there, but you'll see just how small they are. You're talking about something that fits very much into the palm of your hand. So pipistrelles are the most common bat we come across, and they're tiny, tiny creatures, so any fear that you have is very, very much misplaced. Now, this is a very cheap modification we've put into our stable, and it's probably the most successful thing we've ever done for bats. And it's only, my builder tells me it's a 4x1 timber, so I take his word on it. And there's a gap of more or less going from 15 to 20 millimetres between those two timbers, and that they're used throughout the year. We have, well, they just moved from them at the moment into the other box I showed you, but they're in there in the spring, summer, autumn, and then they actually hibernate them in the winter. So it's extremely cheap, extremely successful, and it's something that could be done in farm buildings throughout the country. They could be metal structures, big, huge open bay barn. You put those in, and they're suitable for bats, even though there's no other timbers in the place. So it's a very cheap, very successful way to encourage bats. You may not see them as clearly as I would hope, but there's a pipistrelle here, and there's two pipistrelles here. So, two here, and there's one here. So they're actually very obvious. So I've been able to monitor them for over 2 years, just watching them in the timbers, and I can tell what dates they're there. So in the summer, they tend to be at the southern end of the stable, and then in the winter, they move to the northern side. So that's the pattern that they've been doing throughout the years now, that they tend to like the hotter bits in the summer, and then the winter, they want the cooler bit. So at the moment, they're all up at the, you might say, the west end of the stable. And what we still have at the moment is the mating season. So the bats in that box would be a male soprano pipistrelle and females. So that's usually the case. And they set up a harem of about 8 females, often in the autumn. The bats can wander into people's houses, and this is actually the Pádraig Pearse's old school in St Enda's, Rathfarnham. And we've known of this roost of Leisler's bats for over 20 years. And they disappeared for a few years, but they seem to be back again, and they actually turned up in the nature room. It's a perfect place for a bat to turn up, really. They have 3 bats turned up in the nature room. So they just sent us the photos to see, could we identify them. This isn't a new type of bat box here. It's accidental in Shirley. But it would be great if we could grow it yourself, grow bats, all over Kells and Teworker and Moynalty. So this is a Leisler's bat. Now with our biggest bats, you'd have a wingspan of up to about 30 centimetres, so a foot in old layman's terms. That's our biggest bat. So any other bats would be smaller than that. So there's no point, the Bat Conservation Trust in Britain have this thing saying that, there's no point in setting up, a bed if there's no breakfast. So it's nice to have a bed and breakfast. So if you want to encourage bats, you grow something for the bats to use. So you grow lovely hedgerow, which will mature trees in it, and there you're going to have a big range of insects encouraged by that, and therefore you encourage the bats and the birds. So something like what Barry was talking about earlier on, the whole thing of interconnectedness and giving them a corridor from moving one place to another. Bats have to move to and from an area and have to move into an area. And I talked about that Nethusius pipistrelle bat. The Nethusius pipistrelle bat hibernates in the southwest of France, and then it's found in the summer in Lithuania, and it's found often, as we said, in Ireland now. It's found in Britain. So they're travelling over 1,000 kilometres. This is a bat the size of a big bumblebee, more or less, and it's travelling huge distances. Now often it will stop off, as Barry was saying, along the way. So if you encourage them to stop off along the way in your farm, you're encouraging, much better distribution for the species in the long term. Now, we talked about climate change, and that's actually even been seen in the species of bat. Some of the southern species of bats are moving further north, and that's what's believed to be happening with the Nethusius pipistrelle and another species called the Coul's pipistrelle, which is turning up in Britain far more than it ever did in previous history. So species of bats are moving throughout Europe. They're changing in their populations. Now, as I said, I'm not only interested in bats, I love bats, but I love most wildlife. And one of the things we set about years ago was to try and encourage newts onto the farm. So we dug out a pond, and we were delighted there. It's 2 years now since our first newts appeared. And some of the mitigation, again, is very cheap. The pond wasn't cheap, but actually we needed that soil to fill in a pit. So we used the soil from that to fill in a pit, and then we had our pond. But I put down old waders there that were torn by barbed wire. And the newts used the waders as their little refuge. So often, there's very cheap ways around things. Old wellies put out for frogs or newts. There's lots of things you could do for wildlife that are extremely cheap. So the other creature that we've been encouraging in recent times was hedgehogs. Now, I know if you go back deep into the history, hedgehogs aren't actually a native species, but still they're an established species, and there's no program of removal. They're not seen as an invasive species, really. So we've been allowing a rescue centre in Dublin to release hedgehogs onto the farm, and they don't turn up very often, but they have been seen by our neighbours in the last few months. So that they do survive. It's just we don't see them again because they tuck away and they're hidden. But again, it's a beautiful creature that actually most people like hedgehogs. There's very little hostility towards hedgehogs, thankfully. Unlike the next creature, which seems to be almost public enemy number one at the moment, and that's the pine marten. Again, a native species that's not been introduced, as some people would believe. They came back in numbers themselves without being kind of re-established anywhere. They just worked their way back once the persecution stopped. Now, like many wildlife creatures, that they can cause problems for people, but if you gear yourself up against it, you can stop any problems. We have chickens ourselves, and we know that pine martens could pose a big problem for our chickens if we don't make the right measures. So, once you protect your wildlife, or protect your chickens, or protect your crops or whatever, there's no reason why pine martens shouldn't come back. And pine martens have been seen in Moynalty, so they are re-establishing throughout the whole island. This is a pine marten box, and this is up in County Armagh, and it's a very heavy box. That's the one thing about it. But they've been putting them in plantations throughout Armagh, and we had a pine marten box built years ago, and a friend put it up in Sligo, and they investigated within a week. So they're a very, very curious creature, a very inquisitive creature. So pine martens are here. They are established in the area again. We don't know to what extent, but they've been seen in Bailieborough, and they've been seen in Moynalty, and seen in Mulla as well. This is another type of box that they're investigating in Scotland, in Galloway, in the forest there. And we went to an exhibition of putting them up and how to deal with checking boxes for pine martens and that. And it's made from an old kind of agricultural drum, more or less. Cut the bottom out and then put in a timber box inside. So very, very straightforward for anybody who's got carpentry skills. I'm not including myself in that. But for anybody with any good carpentry skills, it's very straightforward and very easy. And the most crucial thing is it's very light. The last box I showed you, they said when they were putting them up once, they had one fall. Now, if you can imagine something like that falling from your head from a tree, it'd be the end of it. But this thing is actually very light, so even if it bumped on your head, it wouldn't be as bad. Now, what we're doing tomorrow this isn't it, it's just an example of what they're like, but we're putting in a badger set on our farm. So these are badger chambers, for another job I was doing in Dublin, where the badgers were being moved out of the sets that they were in because of essential engineering work. And these are kind of badger chambers, you might say, the same as a badger set, and they're just then buried below ground and connected with twin wall drainage pipe. And there's a badger living in a set in Dublin at the moment. So then you just bury them underground, and then you just run the drainage pipe into them like this, and the badgers will either take up a residence in them or not. It's the same as a bat box or a bird box. They may not like it, or they may not have something more suitable. If they don't have something suitable, they certainly will use it, and if it's in the right place. So we're hoping that the set will establish on our farm, because they're very welcome there. And they travel through our farm, but they haven't ever built a set at any stage there. So I just thought I'd end on pictures of, nice pictures of badgers on camera, just out of curiosity, because they're an animal that has begun to fascinate me in recent times. So unfortunately, most of the time we see badgers nowadays is dead at the side of the road. And Barry mentioned about the high level of fatality along motorways, and I work on mitigation for motorways and that, and if it's not put in right, it can be a right mess. And even, for example, the the M3, over 100 badgers have died on that since it was built. So that's inside the usual badger set. In this case, as I said, we had to take the badger set out because there was essential engineering work. And you can see inside that they drag in a lot of bedding into the set. And sometimes you can have huge amounts of bedding. And then often they actually have lined it with plastic as well to keep it waterproofed. So they can gather in lots of things that they seem to enjoy, whatever reason. In one case, there was large amounts of glass bottles in one set. I don't know why, whether it was a Coca-Cola addict, but... So as I say, we tend not to see badgers except dead at the side of the road, but they are an animal that's all around us and often very much disliked for the association that's been made with TB. Now, we had hoped to have a speaker tomorrow who can't make it because of a bereavement, Enda Mullen, who's been doing a study on badgers and this association between badgers and cattle. And in a study they've been carrying out in Wicklow for over 3 years at this stage, they found that badgers avoided active farmyards. They went for inactive farmyards or equestrian centres. They avoided cattle as much as they could. And a similar study in the north of Ireland proved the exact same thing with different techniques. In Enda's case, they used radio collars and they plotted where the badgers were. And in the case in the north of Ireland, they put on these called contact collars. So every time this collar contacted with another collar, there was a record. And there were practically no records of badgers contacting with the cattle, and there were 250,000 contacts between cow and cow. So the badgers weren't going near the cattle, they were keeping away from cattle. The cattle obviously were getting near to each other all the time. So it's very hard to see what the link that often is made with badgers really is. So you might wonder why I've got these big stones up on top. It's not to try and knock the badger out by having the stones fall on his head. It's just often there's actually a lot of foxes where I was feeding this badger, and the fox climbs in over the fence, munches everything, and then jumps back over the fence again, and the badger ends up with nothing. So I had to make it heavy here so that only the badger can actually move it because it was too heavy for the fox. So there are very many ways you could encourage wildlife on your farm. Planting the right things, and Father Joe mentioned about linseed, planting for birds, planting for wildlife in general. That's something we've been doing. That's very easily done, especially with the GLOS schemes and that. They are available there. And some of that, as Father Joe said, involved putting up bat boxes and bird boxes. So those options are there. The bat boxes have to be in the right place and the right type before they're actually successful. And I mean, as I say, make sure that gap is small. If your finger is kind of squeezed, but when you try and put your hand in, that's the right size. If you can easily put your hand in, the chances of bats being in those boxes are very, very slim. Try the timbers in any of the sheds you have. Generally, if it's high enough, it has to be a fairly tall shed, but even smaller sheds will have bats. But if it's a tall shed, you could put those timbers in for just, a few euro, and you've got bat mitigation put in, or bat measures, conservation measures, you might say, rather than mitigation, things to encourage bats, birds, or any other wildlife. So the main thing is, it's not actually very expensive. There are ways you can do it for very, very cheap if you have the time yourself just to nail it together, or somebody handy. Usually we call on somebody handy, I have to say, to do the work for us because we're not handy. But they're very easy measures that can be done. And I'm going to stop there. If you have any questions on bat boxes or bird boxes or whatever, you're welcome to them.